I have finalized the transcript, then the recording will be deleted. So it's just to help me not have to scramble and write down everything you say, but then I've got an accurate transcript from this. Any personally identifying details, whether it's your name or things that you mentioned during the conversation, will also be anonymized in the final transcript. So this will be confidential.
Before you delete it, can you do me a favor in that you send me a copy of the, what is it, the MP3, the video thing?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's recording to the cloud, so absolutely I'll send it.
Great.
And the final transcript. So I just use the video just because Zoom transcripts are pretty good, but they miss particularly, topics that are not that usual, that they might, I don't know, the accuracy is not brilliant. So that's why I use the video. So you know me, and this project started because I've really been doing a lot of research on mental illness and how marketing intersects with the consumer journey, so consumers with mental illness. Largely it's been focused on the treatment journey because that's where most of the research is. And in the course of this, we've become really interested in this idea of mental health and mental well-being. And there are some definitions, but the definitions are mixed when you look across the literature, specifically for mental well-being. And so what we're trying to do is to come up with a definition of mental well-being as it relates to marketing and consumer behavior. And we're trying not to reinvent the wheel. Obviously, there's been tons of stuff, largely by yourself, on well-being more broadly, psychological well-being, eudaimonic well-being, happiness, all those topics. But we want it to be broader than the absence of mental illness, which is how most definitions talk about mental well-being. It hasn't been, this specific concept, mental well-being, as we're envisioning it, hasn't been talked about in the marketing literature that much. And so we're interviewing people we're largely interviewing regular consumers to see what they think mental well-being means. But in the course of doing this, we're also trying to interview experts in the field, of which you are one of the preeminent experts. And so I have a discussion guide, but I'm going to only come to it at the end if we have time, because with your expertise, I'm more interested in what you think about the concept and whether there's room for a distinct concept of mental well-being differentiated from all the other constructs that already exist out there. So I'm just going to throw it out to you. When I say mental well-being, what does that mean to you? And yeah.
Right. So more for during the last, I think, probably 20 years or so, we had quite a bit of, essentially a body of literature that has distinguished mental well-being from mental ill-being, or what people involved in psychotherapy and mental health, they make the distinction between positive mental health versus, again, mental health in the negative way, meaning, again, when you're dealing with mental health issues, you're dealing with all kinds of problems from schizophrenia to, anxiety disorders to depression and so forth. So now they're making a very strong distinction between positive mental health and the sort of the traditional way of thinking about mental health in the problematic sense. So in that context, a lot of people in clinical psychology have recognized that positive mental health is not necessarily the opposite of negative mental health. Sort of exactly. Right, and it needs to be construed in a very distinctive way. Let me show you a book that I wrote.
I've probably read it. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. I have it.
This is called The Positive Balance, and it's a theory of well-being and positive mental health. And in that book, and I can send you an article that, in essence, was the sort of the basis of this book. I sort of made the distinction between different types of constructs involved with positive mental health, or what you call mental well-being. And I came up with a sort of a hierarchy of concepts or constructs related to mental well-being. At the very bottom of the hierarchy, you can talk about the physiological level. So what is positive mental health at the physiological level mean? And at that level, again, you're thinking in terms of neurotransmitters. And in the context of mental well-being, again, we're talking about the activation of neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine and endorphins, and these are the kinds of neurotransmitters that ultimately give people a sense of contentment or happiness or joy, that kind of thing. So at that level, again, we can talk about mental well-being at the physiological level, and many of the interventions related to mental well-being at that level involve actually most of the interventions are drug therapies. And there are a lot of drug therapies that again induce a certain level of dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin and so forth. But there are other kinds of interventions at that level too, in terms of, for example, meditation. Meditation has been proven to generate certain kind of neurotransmitters that can induce a state of positive mental health. Then you move up the ladder, the hierarchy, to what you call the emotional level. And there's quite a body of literature dealing with emotional well-being. And emotional well-being, again, here we're talking about a preponderance of positive over negative affect. So if a person is experiencing quite a bit of positive emotions relative to negative emotions, then that person is experiencing a high level of mental well-being. And much of the work involved with Barbara Fredrickson from the University of North Carolina, she's done quite a bit of work on positive emotions from that perspective, and we talk about it in terms of mental well-being at the emotional level. That is to be distinguished at a further, if you climb up that hierarchy, at a further level, which is what we're generally calling a cognitive level. Here we're talking about things like life satisfaction. So much of Ed Diener's work on subjective well-being, he makes the distinction between positive and negative affect and life satisfaction, which is an assessment of how life is going for the individual. So life satisfaction is, in essence, a construct that is an emergent from emotional well-being, but it is cognitive well-being, and it captures how people feel satisfied or dissatisfied with their lives. And again, there's a huge body of literature dealing with that concept. If you climb up that ladder further, and then you deal with, no, I'm sorry, I skipped a step. And the step is the cognitive. We make a distinction between cognitive and metacognitive. And the cognitive, in essence, is what you call domain satisfaction. Domain satisfaction. So again, domain satisfaction meaning that life is segmented in different domains, like work life, like family life, like love life, leisure life, community life. All of these life domains have invested, again, if we're talking about positive and negative affect, positive and negative affect are invested in those cognitive domains. And then if I were to, for example, ask an individual, how do you feel about your family life? How do you feel about your work life? Much of the positive and negative affect that at the emotional level tend to sort of transcend and be contained and invested in those domains. And therefore people become very cognizant of the fact that they feel satisfied or dissatisfied within those life domains, and they can easily verbalize their feelings or articulate those feelings. And this is what we call domain satisfaction. And the idea of positive mental health then is there is a preponderance of satisfaction in a variety of domains, in multiple domains. So a person who is experiencing positive mental health is the kind of person who is happy with family life, with social life, with leisure life, with work life, and so forth. That would be another conception of positive mental health or mental well-being. Then at the metacognitive level, then you talk about things like life satisfaction. If I were to ask you, how do you feel about your life at large? And this is, again, an emergent property from the domain satisfaction. So people, what they do is they think about some of the important life domains, and they tend to make an attribution or make an inference about how they feel about their life in general, based on how important or based on how they feel regarding those domains that are important to them. So again, if a person is a workaholic, and feels that work life is most important, then if you would ask that person, how do you feel about your life in general, then that person is likely to sort of extract that inference from work life, and if that person feels satisfied with work life, then that person is very likely to respond that they feel happy with life at large. So again, here what we're doing is we're climbing up that ladder from the physiological to the emotional to the cognitive to the metacognitive. Now, we also have several layers at the top of the hierarchy, and that one right after the metacognitive is what you call the developmental stage. At the developmental stage, people here we talk about things like personal development. We talk about people contemplating about the meaning of life. People contemplate about what they have accomplished in life in totality over the lifespan. So here again, at that level, we talk about things like eudaimonia, eudaimonia, which captures much of the developmental conception of mental well-being, because it's at a higher level, much higher level. But nevertheless, this is not the top level. The top level is based on another body of literature. It deals with social well-being. Social well-being, which I call it, is at this socio-ecological level. So here we're not talking about just personal development. Again, if you're thinking in terms of personal development as from a Maslow'ian perspective, as self-actualization. So a person who is self-actualized is the sort of the epitome of an experience of mental well-being. Social well-being transcends that in the sense that we're talking about not self-actualization, but we're talking about self and social actualization. So the person who's experiencing a high level of mental well-being is the kind of person that is not fully mentally, cognitively, socially, emotionally, morally developed, but also developed to the point where that person is making a contribution to the family, making a contribution to the community, making a contribution to the world. Here we're dealing with a concept that transcends eudaimonia in the socio-ecological sense, because it captures how the person contributes to society, to the community, to the collective. And this is sort of a burgeoning, a sort of a more recent construct with an entire body of literature. There's a person in sociology who has essentially propagated this conception of mental well-being. His name is Corey Keyes. Corey Keyes. He's the sort of the epitome, or the person who managed to promote this concept with a corresponding body of literature. So again, mental well-being can be construed at different levels of analysis, from the physiological to the emotional to the cognitive to the metacognitive to the developmental and what you might call the socio-ecological levels.
So
that's a mouthful.
What you brought up has led to lots of questions, so I'm going to pick some things apart that I just really want to make sure that I understand properly. You use the word hierarchy several times, so you envision, and you mentioned Maslow, are you envisioning this as a sort of hierarchy where one level needs to be fulfilled before another can be accomplished? I mean, the physiological one is sort of a consequence in some ways of having work-life satisfaction, right? So you have, good neurotransmitters and endorphins and things.
Yeah. So in this book, I essentially developed a theory that connects the dots, connects those different levels. And I made the case that there are, using systems thinking, and if you're familiar with the concept of emergent properties or emergence, that at a higher level, there's an emergence of a new state of being that is based on the lower level, accompanied or conjoint by some other mechanism that makes this emergent property distinct from the subordinate property. So yes, indeed, the argument can be made that this hierarchy, they are not distinct in the sense that they are not connected. They are connected in the sense that the lower levels tend to feed to the higher levels in a systematic, in a systems type of emergence. So you cannot experience, for example, emotional well-being without experiencing it at the physiological level, where you have a surge of serotonin or oxytocin or dopamine and that kind of thing. And the surge of these neurotransmitters tend to produce positive emotions. And the positive emotions, like, for example, joy and happiness and contentment, these are essentially physiologically based, but now they are appraised cognitively. And we put labels to them. So this is happiness, this is joy, this is contentment, this is elation, or this is misery, for that matter. So what we're doing at the emotional level is that we use those physiological responses, but we appraise them and we put labels to them, and therefore that positive and negative affect is nothing more but an emergence of the feel of the physiological experiences that we had in our brain, accompanied or conjoined with an appraisal process. So when you cognitively appraise the emotional or the physiological experience, then it becomes emotional well-being. And so you climb up that ladder in that sense, where again the lower level of well-being feeds into a higher level of well-being. It feeds into it, but it is not the only factor that contributes to it.
Okay, I have so many questions, and one that just popped up when you were explaining that part of it, this appraisal of the emotions, like this labeling of them. This is kind of an aside, but people can take the same experience and appraise it differently. So like Carol Dweck stuff, if somebody is very open and has a growth mindset, then they may take a negative experience and see it as an opportunity, and therefore it can actually potentially improve their mental well-being. So is that there's individual differences all along the way at these different stages. So presumably people have different biological or physiological states, like differences, like maybe some people just have fewer endorphins or like purely physiologically, and then how you interpret events and how you translate them. So this can all be different per individuals at each level of the hierarchy.
Right. So again, the point that you're making, and again, I talked about it in the book, but so what you have is not only the lower levels tend to contribute to the emergence of higher levels of well-being, mental well-being, but you also have interactions involving higher levels of well-being tend to influence lower levels of well-being. And that's the argument that you're making, which is again, the appraisal process, for example, can be very much affected by a person who is much more emotionally and cognitively and socially well developed, mentally speaking, at the higher level, and therefore that person is at a higher level of eudaimonia, for example. So eudaimonia can influence, you know, the physiological responses as well as the appraisal process that is at the lower level. So again, there is a reciprocal process, interaction between the different levels, not only the lower levels contributing to the higher levels, but also the higher levels contributing to the lower levels.
So, at a sort of stepping back view, do you see positive mental health or mental well-being as a state that people are seeking to achieve, or is it's just something that occurs over time as all these different processes take place? Is it a goal of people?
Yeah. One can make the argument from an evolutionary psychology perspective that there is an inherent tendency to seek a higher level of mental well-being, that there's this disposition to move people at the higher levels, from the lower levels to the higher levels. One can make the argument from an evolutionary perspective in terms of how people have evolved cognitively, socially, emotionally, and so forth, as well as contextualized in the context of communities and societies. There is an inherent drive to move to the higher levels of mental well-being. And of course, the epitome of the highest level of mental well-being at the socio-ecological level is how a person not only can develop personally from a cognitive, social, emotional, moral perspective, but also at the collective level. At the collective level, meaning at the community and societal levels.
Okay.
There is that inherent drive towards, yes.
Okay. You've used mental health or positive mental health and mental well-being sort of interchangeably. Do you think that they're the same construct?
Positive mental health is the same thing as mental well-being. The traditional conception of mental health is equivalent to mental ill-being. Right.
Yeah. So my next question, let me just make sure that I've covered the questions from the model that I had. Okay, so given all this, this is a well-developed model. How, in your expert opinion, well do you think it is discussed or used in consumer behavior research, marketing research, business fields perhaps more generally? Is this, because our sense is that this is that this understanding of mental well-being hasn't moved into marketing right now.
Well, it has in different ways.
Yeah.
And maybe I can expound on that. So goods and services tend to induce different levels of mental well-being. One can argue, one can make the case that, again, if you're, for example, eating whatever 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 you're eating, food and beverage, for example. Again, food and beverage tends to induce certain levels of, again, serotonin, and most likely, and 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 with it a certain level of mental well-being. So one can analyze the consumption of products and services at the physiological level, and make product innovations and food and beverage innovations, as an example, in a way that would induce certain neurotransmitters that we know will lead to higher levels of well-being. The same thing can be said in terms of the consumption of goods and services at the emotional level. We can talk about experiential consumption, for example. Experiential consumption is a topic in consumer behavior that is designed to capture, again, those positive and negative emotions that people experience in the context of consuming a particular good or service. At the higher level, again, we're talking about things like domain satisfaction, which is essentially a cognitive level. Here, where there is actually quite a bit of research, and much of that research has been done by my colleagues and I, dealing with consumer well-being. So you can envision that there is a domain, a life domain, that you can talk about it as the marketplace, or you can talk about consumer experiences in one's locality, so one's immediate locale. And you can say, well, how do you feel about your shopping experience? Actually, the goods and services that you buy from where you live. How do you feel about, again, there is a particular model that we've used over and over again. We talk about it, the consumption life cycle. And that is, in the context of one's local area, people have certain feelings about the acquisitions of goods and services, meaning shopping experiences, and the way they prepare those goods to make them, to personalize them, and the satisfaction that is extracted from these types of experiences, from actually the consumption of those goods and services, the maintenance and repair of those goods, the disposal of those goods, and how satisfied they are in terms of all the different stages of the what you might call the consumption life cycle, and how those different stages, the satisfaction of those stages life cycle, feed into life satisfaction. Now that is a model that we have been using, and it created quite a bit of buzz, so to speak, in consumer behavior and macro marketing, as well as quality of life research. So that is an example of how, again, in the context of life satisfaction and domain satisfaction, consumer well-being can be construed as such. At the higher level, in terms of life satisfaction, again, we have consumer behavior models that deals with how, for example, healthcare types of experiences and healthcare consumption can affect life satisfaction. And again, I published a number of studies of that sort. We haven't done much in marketing and the consumer behavior literature dealing with the highest level meaning the developmental level and the socio-ecological levels. And I would love to see a lot more research on that topic, but yeah, maybe your ideas in transformational consumer research may lead to that.
So I understand, I mean, obviously lots of marketing research, the life satisfaction stuff, all research that defines itself as consumer well-being can be repositioned to say it sort of fits into a model of positive mental health or mental well-being.
Sure.
Where am I going with this? What's the difference in your mind between consumer well-being and consumer mental well-being?
Consumer mental well-being is probably more of an umbrella concept that incorporates and encompasses aspects of consumer well-being and aspects of mental well-being. So one can develop this umbrella concept to flesh out, in the context of marketing and consumer behavior, all the different models associated with consumer well-being, and then all the different models and conceptions of mental well-being, and try and, in essence, mesh the two, connect the dots. So I certainly welcome what you're doing. This is wonderful.
That's truly fascinating, because we've always thought of it as not the umbrella thing, but a subpart of, say, mental well-being, and consumer well-being being under that, or mental well-being and consumer mental well-being being a subpart of that, rather than an umbrella construct that's covering both. I guess the difficulty with what we really want to do is encourage marketing researchers to do more work in the area of mental well-being, mental health, and that not just to be limited to, say, not limited, but the way it's been looked at primarily right now is in these areas of, say, life satisfaction, and we want to shove the conversation towards getting people to think about the mental aspect of it, like mentally, how is it contributing to your mental health? Loads of brands these days are talking about, mental health and saying they're doing stuff for people's mental health. And they've definitely got that limited definition of it, right? So mental health as in ill health. So sort of at one hand trying to be broad, but the other hand trying to narrow it down. And obviously lots of different things can contribute, but
yeah. Okay, there's an idea. And again, it's probably a simple idea, but I think it can help with that effort. Much of marketing has focused on consumer satisfaction, or customer satisfaction for that matter. And, there are so many models and really a huge body of research on customer satisfaction. If you want to essentially nudge the discipline in the direction of mental well-being, then I would say substitute customer satisfaction with those mental well-being concepts, from experiencing, well-being as a matter of fact, neuromarketing. Are you familiar with this surging movement within marketing that, as focused on neuroscience and marketing? Well, that kind of research, can focus on how, the consumption of goods and services, and literally the marketing of goods and services, period, in general, can affect the inducement or the activation of certain neurotransmitters. So what you're doing is you're substituting customer satisfaction with a mental well-being concept. You can do the same thing with positive and negative affect. You can do the same thing, substitute customer satisfaction with things like domain satisfaction. How does the consumption of goods and services contribute to increases in satisfaction in family life, in work life, in leisure life, in community life, and so forth? Substitute customer satisfaction with these mental well-being concepts. You can do the same thing with life satisfaction. How does the consumption and the marketing of goods and services contribute to, again, people's life satisfaction? So what you're doing is you're substituting customer satisfaction with life satisfaction. And as a matter of fact, that has been done in the context of industrial organizational psychology and management, human resource management, where there's a huge body of literature working on the idea of job satisfaction and connecting job satisfaction with life satisfaction. So again, a lot of management psychologists have kind of looked at, what are the mediators between job satisfaction and life satisfaction? What are those moderators? What are the antecedents? What are the consequences? That is literally a paradigm of research that has been emerging over the many, many years in human resource management as well as industrial organizational management. So one can borrow this paradigm from that discipline into marketing and look at customer satisfaction and life satisfaction and look at the mediators, the moderators, the antecedents, and so forth, and build that paradigm to its fullest.
Because in your hierarchical model, life satisfaction does not equal mental well-being. It's part of the process, and there's things that lead into that, and then there's layers on top of that, the developmental layer, the social ecological layer. And so it's not sufficient to just consider life satisfaction as a measure of mental well-being.
But that's my theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, you in marketing and consumer behavior, we don't necessarily have to come up with a composite index of positive mental health or mental well-being by taking into account all of these concepts. You can do the kind of research by focusing on different dimensions of mental well-being without necessarily taking a holistic perspective.
I understand you can do research at the different levels, but do you think you can achieve, I don't know, full, whatever that might mean, mental well-being if you haven't gotten to the social sort of actualization part of it?
That may be difficult because it would be overwhelming. It would be overwhelming. I mean, ideally, that would be fantastic. That would be music to my ears to do this. But realistically, pragmatically, I think we probably have to focus on the different dimensions and do the kind of research on those dimensions, and maybe combine some of those dimensions. But combining all of the dimensions in one concept? Oh,
So if I asked you, which I have been asking other people, how would you rate your mental well-being? And you're thinking of your model, presumably if you're thinking about your mental well-being, not in a layperson's way, but do you think it's measurable with a number? How do you think?
no, not in that sense. There's again, a huge body of literature focusing on how people rate their health. So you ask them, how do you feel about your physical health? How do you feel about your mental health? And all the anomalies, all of the problems associated with the subjective assessment of one's physical and mental health compared to the actual conditions of their physical and mental health. So physical health is much easier to assess subjectively, and you probably find a little bit of correspondence between subjective physical health and objective physical health. But at the mental level, people delude themselves, meaning that they're very likely inflate their self-assessment of their mental well-being compared to the actuality, the reality of their mental well-being.
That's actually really interesting. So I just read about a study that was conducted. It was by a private company, and I can't remember who the company was right now, but they found that 1 in 10 consumers rated their mental well-being as problematic, and 4 out of 5 doctors recommended their mental well-being as problematic.
Interesting.
Yeah, so because I've been, there's all these surveys that come out that show that mental health is declining, and by that they mean typically mental illness, right? Not mental health, mental ill-being. But seeing this difference between people's own perception, and I've just assumed that everybody's aware of, their own declining mental health, because that's what these surveys have seemed to suggest. I would have to say I was a little bit surprised by this one, where people's own ratings were so much lower than the doctors' ratings.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised to see that.
Now, this wasn't an academic study, and it wasn't, had been subject to any kind of review process or anything at all. It was just a popular press website.
We know from, so many studies of mental health or mental illness that the first step towards any kind of intervention, a mental health intervention, is recognition of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And invariably, to a large extent, people fail to recognize that they have a problem. And that's the first step towards treatment. Mm-hmm. And people don't even recognize that they have a problem. And when they're confronted with the possibility of seeing a counselor or a therapist or a psychiatrist, they really have to hit bottom before they come to that recognition. So it's not easy for people because we all have egos. We're motivated by self-esteem, and to acknowledge and accept that we have a mental illness, my goodness, that is so deflating self-esteem wise. And it's against our human nature to make that acknowledgement easily.
Why are people like say with COVID, and they did all these studies where people said, feeling lonelier, I'm feeling not as happy. They weren't necessarily saying they were mentally ill, but they were saying that their mental well-being effectively had been negatively impacted. That would suggest that there's something in between recognizing that you might have a diagnosable mental illness that needs treatment and recognizing that you're not as satisfied as you had been in the past.
Yeah. And yeah, that's, uncovering those mediating constructs would be a challenge, and would be wonderful to try and be able to identify those constructs. And there's a lot of room for research to do this.
Do you think, so one thing we've been playing around with is conceptualizing it as a resource. So mental well-being is a resource that some people will start off with higher or lower levels, right, based on, say, some of the physiological things that you talked about and how they go about interpreting events and things. But just like some of the more recent literature on coping, they consider coping strategies to be a resource that you can grow and improve. What do you think about the idea of mental well-being as not necessarily a goal, but a resource that you have higher and lower levels of over the course of your lifespan, over different points in time?
Absolutely. And this is where resilience comes in. There's, again, a body of research on resilience and understanding psychological resilience is very much connected with mental well-being. Those people who have higher levels of mental well-being are resilient. They bounce back from adversity. Having, again, it's like you said, it's a wonderful psychological and social resource that allows people to deal with and cope with life adversities. Yes, no doubt about it.
Okay. Do you think mental well-being, and again, this is thinking about it as something that someone could assess of themselves, is it always comparative? So you're either comparing to someone else, like self-esteem, or you're comparing within yourself to a previous time?
This is where we get into the concept of life satisfaction, because there's a huge body of literature that focuses on how people make those judgments about their lives when they're happy. And some people make their judgments based on different standards of comparisons. So they compare themselves to others, they compare themselves to the past, they compare themselves in terms of what's expected of them and what they've accomplished. They expect that they compare, they make those judgments based on what you call deserved expectations or equity considerations. And so there are so many different reference or standards of comparisons that people use to make those life evaluations. And yes, there's a huge body of literature on, for example, social comparisons, how people, make life satisfaction types of decisions based on comparing themselves to significant others. And there's what you call a top comparisons versus down comparisons, where you're comparing ourselves against people of lower status versus, comparing ourselves with those people who are more accomplished than you. Again, the literature is humongous in social psychology dealing with that topic.
Yeah, and that's sort of where we're struggling with, is trying to, obviously we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we do think there is a unique construct there of consumer mental well-being, not just. So when you look at the existing definitions of mental well-being, about, it's like that two-part model. So you've got illness, but also your ability to thrive in life, irrespective of whether you have got a diagnosed mental illness, and it being about your ability to conduct everyday life tasks. That's sort of mental well-being. Do you think there is room for a construct of consumer mental well-being?
I'm sure there's plenty of room. One can take the concept of mental well-being and conceptualize it in so many different ways based on so many different dimensions. Look at the, connect consumer well-being and to a whole bunch of consumer behavior types of outcomes, and come up with models that focus on mediation effects, moderation effects, antecedents, consequences, on and on. I mean, just sky's the limit.
Yeah, but we want it to be clear how it differs from existing literatures on life satisfaction or on consumer well-being.
Well, life satisfaction, my goodness, again, the body of work in that area is also humongous. If you're interested, I can share with you a bunch of articles in which my colleagues and I have worked with the concept of life satisfaction in a marketing context, and that may provide the impetus or the inspiration to develop comparable models with. Sure, I'd love to share that work with you.
Is this so? Anything published by you? I've got it's. So we've been. The team is a big group of authors, and we've all taken a look at a different area. So someone's looked at life satisfaction, someone's looked at mental illness, like these different areas that might play into this construct to develop an understanding of what's already out there and how we might be able to fit in something that's unique or different from existing constructs. I'll tell you, do you know the food well-being model? Food well-being?
No.
The food well-being model came about, it was also a TCR project, but it was initiated from this idea that existing marketing literature is about 20 years old now. No, not that long, 15 years. Existing marketing literature, when they talked about food and consumers' relationship with food, it was very much in this medical, paternalistic sense of you should be consuming X amount of calories or no fat, and completely missed like the social aspects of food and the pleasure aspects of food and all of these other things. And so the goal was to shift it from this sort of paternalistic approach to one that was far more grounded from consumers themselves. And so they developed this model. I was on the team of food well-being that had several different arms. It was a purely conceptual model. And since subsequent research has gone on to think about, like, is this measurable and is this realistic and all the rest of it. But that's kind of where this came from, in that there seems to be an increasing talk about mental health in the marketing literature, but no one sort of sat down in the marketing literature and said, this is what mental health is. When if you're doing research, so this is what it can include, this is what it should include, these topics are not mental health related topics. It's kind of so broadening, but also setting the boundaries of what research on that area is. I don't know.
Yeah, plenty of room to do all kinds of work. Especially when it comes to food well-being. My goodness, that would be the kind of research that would be very substantive and very helpful in many ways.
There's been a lot on that since, but okay, you've given me lots of food for thought. Are you okay if I drop you emails periodically with further questions, clarifications, sending you latest thinking? Yes?
Yeah, I'd love to connect, and if I can help in any way, don't hesitate to call, or we can. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Jay.
I'm going to let you go now. I'm going to hit stop recording here.